The guy who joins me now, Michael Johns, was former speechwriter for George Bush, and one of the patriots and leaders and co-founders of the Tea Party movement. Michael Johns has been in studio with us before, but today he joins us from his, it looks like, bedroom. Hey, Mike, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing all right. How you been, John? Yeah, I do miss the Broadway studio. Walking around Wall Street with you was like walking around with Jamie Dimon or Lloyd Blankfein or someone. I mean, you're a legitimate Wall Street rock star, and that was a good time.
Well, thank you for that. I don't think I'm quite in that league, but I certainly have a colorful cast of characters that have tremendous Wall Street acumen behind them, and I've been lucky to be mentored and taught by a lot of great people, and we're lucky to have you back on the show. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Mike, well, I know you want to talk about today's, I gave you a little preamble there in your introduction that the media is just, it's not even news anymore. I mean, no matter which side you look at, the left, the right, no matter where you look, to me, it's just like it's all opinion and propaganda. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is I think people are going to be so sick of the news channels when they get out of quarantine that maybe the news channels will have to work a little harder for people to watch.
Well, that is the ultimate irony, isn't it? That you have, the media sort of mocking Trump's, mid 40 support numbers, and their credibility and support numbers have, never really surpassed the teens. They're the American media, mainstream media, and I would exempt some of the great media outlets that you just got done citing, like Newsmax and OWN and others, and Fox even News. But the mainstream media has really become one of the least credible institutions in the entire United States. The three classes of individuals that probably have the least credibility with the American people are media, Congress, and attorneys. And so the media misrepresentation on Trump is obviously nothing new. That's been going all the way back literally to Inauguration Day, and during the campaign. But now I think this takes on a like almost profoundly greater magnitude of national significance, because we're not simply talking about politics. In fact, we're almost not talking about politics at all. This country is on the verge of having to make some really sensitive and important decisions, balancing the seemingly conflicting priorities of being protective of public health, because obviously we could all stay in our houses for the rest of our lives and probably be okay. That's not an option. And reopening this economy, which, as the president correctly said, was humming on all cylinders as recently as 2 months ago. So it has what the information that's being communicated by the media to the American people and to policymakers are really, essential. And, I started noticing from day one that there were just these fundamental misrepresentations, combined with obviously the acts of omission, meaning one of the greatest needs right now is for investigative journalism as it relates to what precisely went on in the World Health Organization, what precisely went on in Wuhan, why was the information coming out of there not forthcoming, not accurate, what were the precise circumstances on the origination of this hugely threatening global pandemic, and why did the government of China and Xi Jinping essentially look to conceal, and still is likely concealing a lot of this information? They're not collaborating or cooperating with American clinical and CDC and other personnel. They didn't let the CDC in to look at this right away, which would have been immensely helpful for the purposes of containing this virus. And then meanwhile, you look at what the president's actually done, and let me just say, you do have agencies and departments and individuals in the federal government who are experts on pandemics, but, this is sort of hitting us from left field. No one invited it, no one asked for it, and no one with a straight face can say they fully anticipated it. Many of us, like me and like you, I'm sure as well, John, have talked about the need for secure borders and the fact that public health needs are one of the main reasons for that. So we've addressed it in that standpoint, but no one anticipated that this would come. And since it's come, I mean, I think you're looking at far, I mean, the media is projecting this like Trump's not leading the country sufficiently or proactively enough. I would say just the opposite. This has been extraordinarily exceptional leadership. And it all starts with that January 31 decision to close the travel borders with China, which Joe Biden called xenophobic, which every member, a Democrat in Congress, opposed and said shouldn't be done. With Bernie Sanders said as late as mid-February in that Fox News town hall, he would not have done, which the media ridiculed, which China ridiculed. And that has saved thousands, if not tens of thousands of American lives.
No doubt about that. I'm wondering this. When the president says, well, we're going to check out the funding that we give to the WHO, we're going to pull back on it, we're going to put a hold on it. On January 11th, the Chinese admitted the first death, okay? On January 23rd, the World Health Organization came out with a global release where they said that they don't see any evidence of human-to-human transmission, and there's no reason for an international emergency. So
January 14th, exactly what they said, the exact quote was, Chinese authorities have, and I have some new information on this, which is really as new as today, which I'm going to share with you.
Bring it.
Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human transmission of the novel coronavirus identified in Wuhan, China. That was put out as a public release, not even a government-to-government memorandum.
Right.
That was guidance to the world about this on January 14th. So really, you're talking about like literally over a month after it was undeniably clear in China that this was transmittable human to human. So that was utterly misleading. And I had asked myself until today, was that an issue of the World Health Organization knowing that it in fact was transmittable and parroting China's misleading statements about it? Or was it simply an issue of them, actually not being aware of what was going on and taking China at its word? And it appears there was an interview with this Bruce Allard, who's like the number 2 guy within the WHO on BBC a few days ago, where he was pointedly asked on this fact-finding mission to Wuhan what he did to kind of independently validate China's data, because they shouldn't be taking any government, much less China's, the government of China, at their word on this issue. And the answer was, that he didn't evaluate any of the validity of their data. So, in essence, what the World Health Organization did, this organization that we rely on for public health data and information, which we sort of operate, I guess, on the mistaken assumption that they're actually out independently validating and verifying the accuracy of, on the most serious healthcare crisis globally, public health crisis globally of our lifetimes, they did absolutely nothing to independently validate this data and simply took China at its word. And there's reasons for that. China's been immensely influential within this and other multinational institutions. They were very influential in putting the current director, who's not even a physician, into running the World Health Organization. And this has become, like the United Nations, yet another totally politicized institution, which completely misserved not just the American people, but all the people of the world, really, in the moment of critical need.
So, Mike, you said that you got some new information on that, on the CDC and whether they were parroting or whether they were just, being China's puppet. What have you learned in the past couple months?
Well, so this Bruce Allard, who's essentially the number 2 guy within the World Health Organization, finally media, and this is my point about media bias, meaning as opposed to, interrogating and making allegations about the president, who's acted pretty swiftly and even acted swiftly on responsibilities that are traditionally state, not federal responsibilities. No one really got around to asking any senior official within the World Health Organization about this misleading public statement that you referenced, that I referenced, from January 14th, which led many countries of the world to say, it's unfortunate what's happening in Wuhan, but it doesn't look like we have any threat to our country, if you had taken the World Health Organization at the word. So finally, he gets around to being confronted by BBC about what he did, this World Health Organization senior executive, on his visit to Wuhan, and he confirms that he did nothing, and they did nothing to independently validate the accuracy of the data that China was giving the World Health Organization. So in essence, the World Health Organization just served as a conduit for the transmission of what China was telling them. And China, of course, has enormous political and economic interests in downplaying the significance of this. They knew there would be profound economic impacts. They knew there would likely be a travel ban if word got out about its transmittability. And so instead of the World Health Organization going in and demanding access to this data, interviewing clinicians who had seen patients, ostensibly or possibly meeting the actual patients, doing independent assessments of them, and coming back and issuing a really objective, thorough, and helpful report for the world, they took literally pretty much everything China was saying, did a press conference while they were in Wuhan praising the Chinese for their management of this crisis, went back to their headquarters and told the world that there essentially was nothing to worry about, when there was everything to worry about.
Wow. So what you're saying is the World Health Organization didn't say, well, let us send some people over and look at some data. Let us examine the areas. Let us see some autopsies. They just took a press release. China said, here's what we want you to tell everyone. They didn't do any work back-checking it or fact-checking it. They just took it and pushed it out to the masses.
Yeah, they basically took the data that was transmitted to them by China and this fundamentally misleading statement that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission as recently as January 14th, and realized, this was a crisis in China in December, even into late November, and just, simply parroted that line.
Yeah.
So from a policy standpoint, you look, I think, at a whole bunch of conclusions. Number one is, I don't know if this is the time to be dissecting and having the debate over the World Health Organization, but once we get through this thing, I think the president's instincts about this are right. And I really, really like the fact that his initiative on this was to launch an investigation about what precisely occurred within the World Health Organization as it relates to these errors. Were they innocent, or, as I'm starting to think, is it more likely an example of another multinational organization essentially being manipulated by the government of China for the purposes of China's interests, not the interests of global health, and that just simply looks like it's the case. So whether the World Health Organization ultimately can be reformed, whether we should be a part of it or not, you can recall, and I'm sure you do, the United Nations Human Rights Council, once they started putting egregious violators of human rights on it, we simply pulled out. We basically withdrew our involvement. We said, this is not reform. It's not even reformable any longer. When you have the world's worst human rights abusers standing in judgment of our own country, basically, and that's still the case with so many of these multinational institutions, is that they have highly political agendas, often corrupt finances, and it certainly seems to be suggestive here. And in fact, now we have a confirmation that the World Health Organization acknowledges publicly that they did nothing to independently validate the data or the statements that China made, that they then in turn just went ahead and transmitted to the world as fact, which they obviously were not.
So, Mike, I had on Tracy Bean. She's an investigative reporter with Undercover DC. She does some really great work. And I had her on last week, and she was talking about that way back in October, different militaries around the world every year have what's called the Military Olympics, where all the different send teams and they do sporting events. And coincidentally, this year, the Military Olympics for the whole world was held in Wuhan. And the team from the U.S. who went to represent us in these military Olympics, traveled in and out of Washington, the state of Washington, okay? And Tracy followed the tracks there. And if you remember, one of the biggest outbreaks we had in the beginning was in Washington, 44 people in a nursing home.
Correct.
And it's Tracy's contention. She tied this together with other CDC information that as early as November, doctors across the country were reporting a significant spike in something called ILI, influenza-like illness. And the records that she came across with the numbers show that the numbers started to spike in the state of Washington and then spread down the coast and then south and up to New York. There's a very good chance that this thing was running rampant in Wuhan, as early as October, November of 19.
Yeah. Now, the first identifiable case in the United States, we've not, and again, this is the stuff media should be looking into, as opposed to, grilling the president on, some of these absurd allegations that are completely inaccurate. But we do know there was a clinical report written about the first case, and this was in Snohomish County, Washington, a 35-year-old male who had returned from Wuhan 4 days earlier. So that would have been January 15th, John. And he had presented at a hospital there with a cough and fever, and was subsequently, he made aware that he had been in Wuhan, where there was lots of public attention that this existed, and was identified and diagnosed with coronavirus. So that was the singular first case. He went on to recover. And as you correctly pointed out, some of those in that nursing home in Washington State did not. But the origins of this crisis, like if you're going to say where are the areas we most need to be focused from an investigative media standpoint, I think we got to agree that the one country is of China, and what did they and did they not do here is hugely relevant and important. And it's hugely relevant and important to understand the nature of the bilateral relationship we have. We've been working in good faith with them, trying to improve this relationship. I think the president's really done an extraordinary job in those ways in addressing some of the underlying issues that have been ignored for decades by presidents. He says he's built a good relationship with Xi Jinping. I believe he has, but it's important that, if they're misrepresenting this information, that be unearthed. And then obviously this World Health Organization, we may not hear about it a lot until we have an issue like Ebola, or which they also did not manage well, by the way, or the current coronavirus pandemic. But we are relying on an institution of that nature to understand what's going on in countries around the world that represent global public health threats. And it certainly appears from everything that's emerged so far that they proved utterly unreliable, and maybe even consciously not engaging in the sort of work that they should know as clinicians and as public health experts is fundamentally necessary to informing the public. And I think the other issue, which just strikes me, it's sort of like no one's looking into this either, is on the domestic front, you have the probable Democrat presidential nominee, Joe Biden, who, had said the day that President after he put the China travel restrictions in place, which, as you and I pointed out, are one of the most constructive steps taken to date, saved tens of thousands of lives. This is what Joe Biden said, and presumably would have done if he had been in the Oval Office as president. Then he said, "This is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysteria and xenophobia, hysterical xenophobia, and fear mongering." Well, the story the domestic political story here of two parties who had, let's face it, some different views on how this should be addressed back at the end of January and early February are really clear now. We have one president who, against the advice of Democrats in Congress, against the advice of China, which called it an unfriendly measure, against the World Health Organization, and against the ridicule of the media, correctly and boldly took the step to put in place these travel restrictions, which is to me like one of the great acts almost of American presidential leadership in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I mean, it was like
Magnitude of impact that it had
you
in
had
saving lives.
like you pointed out a little earlier, you had the WHO saying in a global release, no reason for international panic, no evidence of human-to-human transmission, and then like a week later, for all these people who are being conditioned by the left-wing media about how Trump acting late cost us lives. With the World Health Organization and China saying nothing to see here, 6 days later on January 29th, he enacts the travel ban to howling and screaming from the left about xenophobia and all this other stuff.
Right.
So you can't have it both ways. Was
And
he
now as of
early? Was he
last-
late? Is he a racist? Is he not? It's crazy.
Yeah, and there's really been almost no scrutiny of Joe Biden's absolutely fundamentally inaccurate, wrong, misguided policy statement as it related to let's face it, the most important policy decision that's been made in this whole pandemic to date. I mean, it's great. It's great that we're doing research on vaccines. It's great that we have FDA approving some, off-label uses. It's obviously great that we're mobilizing the resources necessary. But the singular, most obvious and important measure to take in a situation like this is to stop the bleeding, which means you stop people from coming from the point of origin of this pandemic. And the Democrat presidential nominee apparent, Joe Biden, not only would not have done that, but ridiculed the president of the United States, for doing it. And by the way, this is not the first inaccurate comment he's made as it relates to these issues. The other thing is I can recall, and I looked back a little bit on it about some of his commentary as vice president, and I found that because I remember reading this New York Times op-ed he had written back in 2011, where he used the phrase "China's rise is not our demise." Well, that was like part of basically saying we can both grow peacefully and independently, which basically means China grows and we're at Obama's 1% GDP growth. And obviously, the result of that was we ended up in this situation where as much as 90% of pharmaceutical and over-the-counter medications are being manufactured in China. And importantly, one of the things we learned through this crisis to date was the mid-level Chinese official who came out and said, we might just sort of cut off those pharmaceutical supplies to the United States, which I don't think was a serious policy statement. It was another example of China vocalizing in a braggadocious way the influence it has, which it does, frankly, way too often. But if that's not a wake-up call, as I think Peter Navarro and others are correctly pointing out in this White House, that we cannot have such a reliance on China as this manufacturing hub and the supply chain hub of the global economy. I don't know what is. I mean, the simple reality of it is China a friend? Are they an enemy? Are they something in between? Set the question aside. This crisis points out that we should never, as a country, be in a position where we are reliant upon China for anything that has any degree of urgency or national security ramifications or public health ramifications for the people of the United States of America.
No question. And I try to dumb this stuff down to like regular man speak, but what you're talking about is they make 90% of our pharmaceutical and medications. It's like, if you had an enemy in your neighborhood who hates everything about you and what you are, and you're the same, and at some point you're going to go to battle with him, but it's like hiding your first aid kit at his house. So when the battle starts and you take a few licks, he's not going to give you the first aid you need. It's so crazy that we'd allow ourselves to be committed to a country that basically is on, according to Gordon Chang and others, they've been on a 100-year plan to basically eliminate America. So why would we continue to be beholden to them?
I mean, you look at this 2035 plan they had, which was basically to surpass us as the world's economic leader. They're obviously now the second largest economy in the world. And a lot of us, me included, about really in the early days of the Trump presidency, started talking about this plan. And as we did, and Gordon Chang was someone else who spoke about it, we noticed, and I've noticed, that China has all of a sudden stopped talking publicly about it. But I don't think there should be any confusion. The president in the campaign basically described this in a rudimentary way, but he described it completely correctly. And that is that they are very wise, seasoned, strategic, calculating leaders who definitely put China first and foremost and singularly as their biggest priority. And on top of that, have huge and grandiose aspirations for geostrategic and geoeconomic dominance and control in the world. And you can look at what they're doing in the South China Sea. You can look at what they're doing in these lending programs in Africa, in Latin America, where they are forcing these governments to put up collateral for their development projects and literally seizing key infrastructure entities when they don't make payments. They are gaining a lot of leverage in a very different way than, say, the Soviet Union did, which was much more obvious. When Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan in 1979, everyone saw that. Everyone understood that. They looked at it as an invasion. This is a much more subtle level of geostrategic and geoeconomic dominance and engagement around the world that will be much more difficult to counter, but requires an absolute understanding. And it's one of the reasons that I'm immensely thankful that we have the right guy at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, because you go back, and I know you know this, but for 30 years, he's basically been saying the same message about China, that we were overly reliant, that they were ripping off our intellectual property, that they were devaluing their currency for the purposes of trade advantages, that they were starting to develop strategic advantage in key manufacturing areas that were going to ultimately be immensely detrimental. And now here we are in 2020 with a pandemic, reliant upon China for key medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and over-the-counter medications. And we should never again be in that situation. I had a few examples too, by the way. I started writing some of this stuff down about the media bias, which I just think when you start, because these things always arise and you go, well, there's an example, there's an example. When you start to put it together, you really see the magnitude of it. I started with the whole controversy over the ventilators, where the president was grilled for ostensibly telling the governors that they need to go get their own ventilators. Then it turns out it was kind of like the Ukraine call. What he actually said was, obviously, this is a state responsibility. Like, all these states should have been prepared. Cuomo is being praised for his management of this crisis. That's outrageous when you have, over 4 out of 10 cases in this country in New York State. You almost have to look at New York State and then the rest of the country. And it turns out, well, he didn't say that at all. What he said was, if you can get ventilators, go out and get them, and we will support you. We'll be behind you trying to also identify them. Completely misleading the public, making it look like he was being uncooperative with state governments around the country on this crisis. There was the misreporting about him seeking a monopoly on the vaccine, which, of course, if you go into the mechanisms of how a pharmaceutical is actually approved by our FDA and how it's approved in other countries of the world, it's not even conceivable or possible to do that. You had the big lie about the nationwide curfew, if you can recall. There was all this buzz reporting and anonymous sources that we were on the verge of putting into place a national curfew. It led to a major market correction there over about a 2-week period as an underlying fundamental factor of fear to traders and to money managers. Turns out, nothing less than the National Security Council had come out and clarify that there were absolutely not even any contingency plans for doing that. You can recall in the Rose Garden press conference, he brought in all those CEOs of companies and talked about the administration's cooperation with Google for developing a website of resourcing and other things related to treating and handling coronavirus, a virus that would be helpful to the American people. And the media then wrongly reported that there was no such project underway. Google subsequently had come out with a corporate statement indicating, yes, in fact, we are working with the administration exactly as the president said. You had this unbelievable story that somehow Trump had eliminated the pandemic department. Now, I've worked in the White House, I've worked in the federal government. There's no pandemic department within the federal government. You have functions that are handled by the CDC, functions that are handled by FEMA, some functions that are handled by the Army Corps of Engineers, the functions that are handled by the National Security Council, functions that are handled by Health and Human Services, by CMS, which manages Medicare and Medicaid services. Turns out, well, this was another Obama holdover in this administration, who I guess subsequently had been terminated, who basically misled the media about some of the restructuring within the National Security Council when Bolton was there. And there hadn't been any elimination of any resources or dedication of personnel to that. It was simply minor restructuring. Again, the American people completely misled about this issue. You had the misreporting that the president has cut CDC funding. How many times have you heard that? I mean, like repeatedly. It's reported all the time. You go in and look at what the actual CDC allocations are. Federal allocations to the CDC have gone up every single year under this president. And the final most outrageous thing is the statement that the president ever labeled this a hoax. That goes back to a speech he gave at a South Carolina political rally where he said the Democrats, in misrepresenting the preparation and efforts that the administration was taking to counter this, that was their latest hoax on top of Russia, on top of Ukraine. This was like the third hoax. He never said that the virus, which wasn't as immensely threatening to the American people, was ever a hoax. And you continue to have, as recently as today, major media outlets reporting that that's what the presidency called it, a hoax.
Yeah, I know. They've transformed what you just said into he called the virus a hoax. No. What he said was they were building this up with all the fear to collapse the market, and this was their new hoax, their new story that they were going to and
saying that the administration was so ill prepared for it.
Yes.
And so mismanaging it. That was the main hoax, that they were ill prepared and mismanaging the crisis.
Yep.
That it would be, but at no point did this president ever. And when I talk about this January 31 travel ban, among all leaders of the world, there has been no leader who was more earlier to the recognition of the magnitude of threat that this represented to the public health.
No
If
doubt.
you go and look at other heads of state around the world, including in major countries, that we were really the first country to put in place a travel ban against China on January 31. I mean, most countries ended up acting subsequently in February, even into early March.
So, Mike, in our last minute here, being it's Friday, I'm trying to get everybody to take their mind a little bit off of all this stuff that we got to deal with. And I've been asking everyone that's been on today if they've discovered, most of us have, our lifelong go-to snacks, but now that we're home and we're eating so much monotony, we're eating other things. And have you discovered a new snack since quarantine?
Well, when I find something I like, I stick with it. So I'm a big fan of popcorn. Buttered popcorn is far and away my go-to source. I'll even concede this point. I have, on occasion, not repeatedly, gone to see movies I would not have seen, except for the fact that I knew I was going to get a big box of popcorn.
All right. Well, look, you better stock up on popcorn because I don't think you're going to be going to the movies for quite some time.
Looks like we got a while here, huh?
No doubt about it.
Thanks for all your good efforts too, John. It's much appreciated.
Hey, we're trying our best here, Mike. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you taking some time today and getting into this stuff because somebody's got to at least try to get through to regular folk like me and you that beneath all this, there's a bigger plan with all this propaganda. And, You know, I wish they would just let the president do his job and not try to infect everybody's minds.
And we got to raise the standard. I mean, I really like the way you worded it at the beginning of, not having an agenda. I mean, I'm a conservative. I suspect you're a conservative. But, I have a great adherence to factual accuracy. To me, that's like a huge part of this profession and of credibility. And I just am astonished at how the American media has completely discarded that as what should be their first and foremost obligation.
Yeah, maybe the president should form, some kind of bipartisan or tripartisan committee where they rank news. You know what I mean? Like if you're actual news, you get an N. You know what I mean? If you're opinion, you get an O. You know what I mean? If you're something like that.
He was widely ridiculed for that video earlier this week in the press room White House briefing. But I looked at that and I said, hold on a second, that's genius. Why would you not start every White House press conference out with a quick summation of any egregious inaccuracies or biases in mainstream media reporting, right?
Yeah.
So you sort of come out and you go, here's the summation of everything we saw over the last 24 hours that was totally inaccurate. Here's why it was inaccurate. Here's the correct information. Call these outlets out by name, call the reporters out by name. They made these allegations in the public domain. They should be corrected in the public domain. And then go ahead with the press conference.
Yeah, I like that idea. It's not horrible. And, just to finish it up, the reason that the left-wing media went crazy is because Trump did something that they refused to do. He put up a video showing the facts. And that's what news is supposed to be, the facts. And they don't want the facts out there for everyone to see. They want to manipulate the truth and propagandize it.
Yeah, they want to hold the president accountable, but they don't want to be held accountable for their errors, which frankly are ongoing, significant, and fundamentally really a great disservice to this country in a lot of ways.
No doubt. Mike, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time with us today. And when we get out of this, you got to come in for a real liquid lunch again.
I'm looking forward to that. That'll be great.
All right. That's Michael Johns. He's one of the co-founders of the Tea Party, former speechwriter for George Bush, and great patriot, great American.